Hey everyone, we're back here with another rapid game, playing against Dancerman34, rated 1661. We're going to start off with knight f3, they go d5. Let's go for c4. Just kind of sticking with my normal kind of ready opening repertoire throughout these rapid games, especially from the white side of things. So c4, kind of similar a little bit to a Queen's Gambit. If he takes, I might play d4 later on, capture the pawn back. But there might also be ideas, as we've seen in some other videos, doing like a fianchetto and stuff like that. So black goes for d4 here. What I'm going to do is... The typical move here is to play g3, bishop g2, e3 eventually, and we're going to get into kind of a Benoni, a reverse Benoni system, if black plays c5, for example. So I'm going to go for that idea here. Let's go g3. See what black kind of does in response. Bishop g2, castle, d3, e3, look to kind of chip away at the center. Even though white does end up being behind on space a tiny bit here in the center of the board, I do have a little bit of extra queenside space, and that's kind of one of the trumps of this opening. I also get a lot of pressure on black center as it comes pretty soon. Let's go ahead and go bishop g2. Going to go for e3 at some point, or maybe d3 then e3. The move order doesn't make too big of a difference. Now, when black goes for g6 and going for bishop g7, another way of approaching this position is to go for b4 and bishop b2. That's another way of putting pressure on the center, especially if black's not playing c5 and not playing knight c6 yet. Usually b4 or b3 and bishop b2 is not that great, because black will play like c5, knight c6, e5, and my bishop will just be staring at the pawn. But if I play b4, black could play c5, I suppose, but I still might, play bishop b2 or take the pawn and then go bishop b2. Just kind of another option of for how to attack the pawn here. So we're going to continue with this. Kind of a double fianchetto attacking the d4 pawn. A little bit tricky for black to guard it. If knight c6, I can go b4 or b5, kick the knight, and then take the pawn. If he goes c5, that's probably the best option here, because if I take the pawn, then he can go knight c6 without b5 being possible. But at the very least, I can still play, e3 pretty soon and still chip away at the center within a couple moves. I guess he could move the knight to open up the defense, but that doesn't tend to be, where's he going to move the knight? If he goes to d7, we can still take the pawn because the queen's blocked off. If he goes to h5, that's just really awkward. So I think he's already, I think c5 is the best move here for sure, because even though I might win the pawn for the moment, black will usually get it back. But I think almost any other move here is going to just lose material for not good compensation is the problem. Okay, so he chooses knight h5, which, like I said, the downside is pretty clear that the knight's just on the side of the board, which is not that great. I could play, it might look a little weird, but I could play like c5 here to stop black from playing c5. I don't want to go e3 because this pawn isn't actually pinned with the knight being, the knight defending the bishop. If I went e3, I'd actually be losing material because black could take on f2 with check and then recapture the bishop on g7. So, I'm going to go ahead and play d3 here, I think, just to lock the pawn in place for the moment. The next idea is going to be knight d2, knight b3, going after the d4 pawn. So that's still the target. Even if black is forced to play e5 at some point, then I can maybe follow up with e3. Again, e3 doesn't work here because of the take e3, take f2 problems. So I'm not necessarily in a rush to castle. I kind of want to get the knight to b3 as quickly as I can, so that I can put that pressure on black center. If I castle, we kind of give black a free move, an extra move, I would say, to defend his center or something like that. So even if he plays c5 now, I can still play knight b3 and look to win the d4 pawn. Or take on c5, then knight b3 maybe. e5 is probably going to be necessary at some point. The drawback to e5, though, is that it will then block the bishop in, and it'll be easier for me to play e3 at some point. So if he did... Okay, so he does play e5, for example. Now I can kind of lean a little bit more towards this plan of castling, rook e1, and then e3. Because if the pawn takes, the rook takes, and then e5 is the new target. So I am going to castle here. Rook e1, e3 is the next plan at this point. And again, this entire setup essentially is geared around pressuring the opponent's center, because he does have the space advantage in the 4 central squares at the moment. Knight c6 hits this pawn. I could play b5 to attack the knight and then kick it away somewhere. I could also just play like a3 and keep the knight, or keep the pawn protected, but I kind of like the idea of hitting the knight and seeing where it goes. If he goes back to e7, I'll still follow up with rook e1, maybe queen b3, e3, something like that. I don't really want to play e3 now, of course, because he could take it and then the d3 pawn is attacked. And even if I did queen b3 and then e3, he would trade it, and then I don't have the rook on the e-file. So I'm going to go... I don't know if the move order matters too much at the end of the day. I think I'm going to go rook e1, getting ready for this. But a little bit of the thing I have to watch out for as well is if I play e3 too soon, pawn takes, rook takes, he can play knight f5, kick the rook away from protecting the pawn on the pawn that would be on d3 that would be undefended at that point. So probably going to have to follow up with queen b3, then e3 still, or something along those lines. This knight on h5, notice how this is still very much misplaced. Can't go back to f6 because that'll just pick the pawn up for free. Black also has to worry about the pawn on b7 being a little bit tender, because if the bishop moves away, I might move the knight off of f3 at some point. So black does have a space advantage in the center, but I'm better on the queen side, and especially if I can play e3 soon, that'll kind of break apart black's center pretty quickly here. If black ever plays c5, I might play things like knight b3 and look to target the pawn, because he can't play b6 due to the diagonal opening up. If he plays c5, I probably wouldn't capture on passant, because then the knight would just come back protecting the center. So he does play rook b8, not a bad idea necessarily. He has maybe prepared to play c5, and then he can play b6 safely because he's off of the diagonal. He also maybe is just trying to protect the pawn here. So I'm going to go, I think instead of queen b3, which I was pointing out earlier, followed by e3, I think I'm going to go knight b3 actually, with the idea of stopping him from playing c5, and then I'll still play e3. Because if I play e3 now, he might maybe play c5. And then, so actually, sorry, e3 now is still going to walk into pawn takes, rook takes, knight f5, and then he'll take on d3 pretty soon. Even that, though, is probably still okay for me, because even though he gets d3, I do get e5. The position opens up pretty quickly. But again, e3, c5 maybe is the response. And he might try to play b6 after that. So, yeah, I think I'm going to go knight b3, actually. Just stopping any c5 ideas, and e3 next move. I won't have to worry about the pawn on d3 ever, because the queen will be now protecting it. Knight e4 I don't think is as good as knight b3, because knight e4 does aim towards c5, but it doesn't aim towards d4. So e3, there's going to be a lot of pressure put on d4 here after e3. I do have to be a little careful of some tactics, though, because e3, pawn takes, rook takes. He does have e4, attacking my bishop but attacking the knight. And if I take on g7, he takes my knight on f3. I guess it's probably fine, though, because I can take on f8. I've gotten a rook and a bishop. If he picks up my bishop, he's gotten 2 minor pieces, and I can even pick up a 3rd minor piece. So, yeah, I think e3 will still be working out tactically. He plays f5. So the downside of this is it opens up this diagonal towards the king, blocks off knight f5, blocks off the bishop. He's not going to play e4 anytime soon, because I can always take it and then take d4. So I think I can still just play e3. Pawn takes, rook takes, and the e5 pawn is going to be really hard for him to protect. If he plays e4, I still have bishop takes g7, which is fine. So I think e3 is still working out in this position here. e4, at any point, I can always just take on d4, or in this case, I'll take on g7. And if he doesn't do anything, I'll just take a d4 2 times and just win a pawn. So he has to be a little careful about that. Okay, we're going to take with the rook. I could take e5, but then he gets to take f2, and my king gets exposed a bit. So I'm going to take with the rook. That was the idea. And now the question is, how does he guard this? Because I have 3 attackers. He only has 1 defender. He doesn't really have a way to protect the pawn. That's kind of the main drawback here. He does have maybe f4, counterattacking my rook. And that could get a little interesting. I don't want to take it because then after pawn takes back, I don't have the e5 target. He could also take with the knight, which would be a very strong spot for the knight. But yeah, I think if he goes f4, I'll probably just retreat. That's probably his best move, though. He needs to stir up some counterplay at this point. If he's not creating counterplay, then he's going to be in some trouble, I would say. If he doesn't do that, e5 is probably just hanging. So yeah, f4 I think is his best move. e4 is what he plays. I think we had said earlier that this doesn't really work because I can take on g7 first. If he tries to take on f3, I take on f8, and then I hit the knight on e7. If he just takes back on g7 right now, I'll just take the pawn, and I'm just going to be winning a pawn there, it looks like. So we're going to be up a pawn. And once we're up the pawn, then we can just work towards converting the material advantage. So, again, I don't think he can take the knight because I take the rook. Sometimes there are sequences where they can take the knight, then the bishop. That would be the case if the rook was not on f8. If the rook was on e8 or f7 or something like that, then pawn takes f3 would be good because he would essentially, if I'd get a bishop, he'd get a knight, but he'd be attacking my bishop and, well, he'd be attacking both of my bishops at that point, and I wouldn't have a way to protect both. So this specifically works for me to take on g7 because the rook's on f8. If the rook was on a square where the bishop wasn't attacking it, then if it was on e8 or f7, then black would be doing pretty good in this sequence. But because I do have bishop takes rook next move, pawn takes knight doesn't work. So we're going to pick up the pawn. I think after knight takes g7, for example, or king takes g7, once I take, he should probably take back. But even then, that gets a little tricky because rook takes, and I'm threatening to trade queens. Whoops. Even after this trade, I'm threatening to trade queens, take the knight on e7. So he's in a little bit of a tricky spot here. I think he just has to take the bishop, though. Anything else he does will be farther behind in material than just being down 1 pawn. So he does take on g7 here. And now we're going to take on e4. That was the idea. Our queen's protected, which is obviously very important. I don't know if I necessarily want to take on f5 and let the knight come up to f5. But at the very least, we're just up a pawn with a pleasant position. Queen trade's going to be pretty, pleasant for us. The knight might also go to c5 and then knight to d4, and there will be fork ideas on e6. He plays f4 in response here. I could trade queens, but then I do give him control of the d file. I could also just go rook d3, which looks pretty good. Rook d3, force him to play queen e8, and then it's a little bit awkward for his pieces in that situation. So let's go rook d3. Trading queens when you're ahead in material is generally good, but I could also keep the queens on the board and combine this with an attack on the king. So once the queen moves away, knight d4, knight c5. Those are some ideas here. I'm going to go knight d4 first, because if I go knight c5, he might play bishop g4, pin the other knight that's left over. Knight c5, though, does have the benefit of maybe knight d7, which I'm looking at a bit more. So if I went knight c5, he went bishop g4, I could almost just play like h3, have him trade, and then maybe once the bishop's gone, these squares are very strong. So maybe bishop g4 is not actually something to worry about at this point. Yeah, maybe it's not even a concern, I'd say. So let's actually move the knight. This knight has a couple more threats than the one on d4 does. d4 aims towards e6, but the knight on c5 aims towards e6 and d7, which could be annoying for him if I can get the rook to the 7th rank here. So he plays b6. I think knight d7 was the idea. Gonna force the trade. The nice thing is once I take, I'll also have ideas of queen d4 once the rook is up down there on d7. So he has to take pretty much. I take. If he tries to go rook d8 and fight for the file, I can check and then triple up on the file, which is pretty nice. Next, I might go for knight d4. Okay, so he does go rook d8. If I if I do all the trades on the d file, he does get the open file, which is a little bit annoying. So I'm going to throw in the check here. I guess he does have knight f6, which could be a little annoying. But even then, I can trade rooks, play rook d8. Something like that should be pretty good. He does go knight f6, so I can't go rook d1 now because rook takes d7. The knight's also attacking it there. So let's go ahead and... I can't take c7 because of the pin, so I have to watch out for that. I'm going to go ahead and make the trade. Actually, after queen takes, I could now go e5. If he trades queens, then he can't deal with the fork and the attack on the knight at the same time. So e5 is actually looking pretty good. Depending on where the knight goes, I might still play rook d1 or something like that pretty soon. Yeah, let's play e5 here, just to kind of see what happens. The other thing is, by playing e5, it opens up the bishop. Now, I can't take on f6 here. This is very important. This is kind of like the pawn takes f3 sequence earlier. If I take on f6, the queen can actually take back. But if I take with the knight, there's not a good way to deal with both of these threats. So, gonna still get the fork on e6 here once the knight moves. Pick up the rook, be up the exchange, and it looks like he ends up resigning in this position. So, okay, so we get the win here. Let's go ahead and analyze this one. So let's go check it out. Okay, so it starts off knight f3, d5, c4, d4. So this is kind of a, like I said, a reverse Benoni. The normal Benoni opening looks something along the lines of d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5. And then usually at some point black will play like e6. We can kind of see the similarity though if in the pawn structure here. This kind of d5, knight f6, the d and c pawns, sorry, next to each other in this kind of situation. We see the same thing right here. D and c pawns next to each other, knight on f3. If you just, put this here, and put this knight there instead, it would be the same kind of setup for the most part. The difference is that it's white's move, so white is kind of maybe a half a move ahead. But it is still a very solid setup for black. So I go for the fianchetto. I think what black usually should be doing in these cases is playing like c5, if I castle, knight c6, something like this. I would still follow up with a very similar plan of playing like e3, looking to hit the center. Something along these lines is usually, let's say like b3. Sometimes white will go for bishop a3 trades, or maybe get the knight back here and play a3 and b4. But this would at least be like more solid, I would say, for black, because his pawn is protected very well. Both pawns are protected well, and he has more space in the center. Whereas the way he plays in the game, where he does the fianchetto on g7, he does get the pawn on d4, but now becomes a target because it's harder to play c5 and e5 ideas. And knight c6 would just be kicked away by b5. I do think at this point his best move is probably to play c5. The idea being, if I do take the pawn, it looks like it's free. But now he can play knight c6, for instance. He keeps this pawn protected, and he'll get the pawn back on c5 pretty soon. Like, it's going to be hard to stop him from getting that pawn back at this point. if I play bishop a3 and get super greedy, he can start doing stuff like d3, hit the rook, and it gets a bit tricky in this position. So if he had played c5, I think I probably would honestly just castle. He still can't take the pawn because if he does this, I take back on d4, for example. And we have traded pawns. I'm not ahead of pawn, but I've traded off essentially a b pawn for a d pawn, which is a good situation for me. I have more central pawns left over in the position compared to black. So later on, once I move the knight, I can play d4, e4, and I'll have more space in the center. So I do think he should do this, though, and then not take on b4. Probably just castle. I'd go d3. Maybe now he goes knight c6. If I go b5 now, it's not as problematic for him because he's already got the pawn on c5. But even here, my plan would still be the same as before. I'd play e3. I'd look to chip away at the center, or maybe rook e1 and e3, something like that. So anyways, though, he played knight h5 in the game to defend the pawn. And this has the drawback of just being a very awkward square for the knight. So I went ahead and just played d3, castle, knight to d2. He played e5. However, my main plan is still the same at this point. I just want to get castled, and I want to attack the center. So e3, a pawn break that's very important here that I'm going to have to play at some point. So whenever you're trying to figure out a plan, especially if it's a closed type position where there's not, where there's still a good number of pawns on the board, you want to look in the direction of your pawn breaks usually. Which direction of the board do I have more space on? Which side of the board do I have the space advantage on? But also where my pawn breaks. Look at the opponent's central pawns. Look at where they're attacking, and see if you can put a pawn on one of those squares. C3 is obviously not possible. F4 would be possible to attack E5, but it's just a bit risky because of the king. So the only leftover option is E3. So that's what I was working towards throughout the game. So castle, knight C6, B5, kick the knight away. Rook E1, rook B8. I decided to go knight B3. I probably could have just played E3 right away. I think that would have been okay. What I was a little concerned about was maybe pawn takes, rook takes, knight F5. I move the rook away. He takes on D3. But really, in hindsight, this is still very good for me. I could just play like bishop takes E5. We've traded off his two central pawns for my two central pawns. But he did have more space. Now he doesn't. And I also have a lead in development, which is good. I have he has two pieces that aren't really doing much. Even the rook on F8 is not doing much. The knight on H5 is pretty awkward. Stuff like that. Plus, even right here, I don't even actually have to take the pawn. I didn't really see this during the game either. I could just play G4. So the knight going to F5 doesn't really help that much because it kind of walks into G4. So maybe in hindsight, playing E3 right away was a bit better. Maybe black would not take the pawn and he would play C5 instead. But then maybe, I don't know, maybe I could do like take, and then something like knight B3, and this pawn is definitely still a big target here. So I could have played maybe E3 a little quicker, but I think knight B3 is still pretty solid. He did F5. I think F5 is definitely kind of a misplaced move. Maybe he should do, I don't know, maybe again like a B6. I go E3, maybe still a C5 move, trying to protect the center. I take on passant, he takes back. I take, he takes. Again, I have a lot of pressure on the center, which is pretty pleasant. This pawn specifically, black needs to keep it protected. But at least, he still has a center. As the game goes, he took on E3. I took back with the rook. Like I said during the game, I think his best counterplay is F4 here. But even if he had done this, I'd probably just move the rook. And he's still going to lose the pawn on E5 pretty soon anyways. E4 still doesn't work because the bishop takes G7. And then I would just take the pawn back. So I think that was his best chance of counterplay. E4, though, doesn't work right away either because I take on G7 first. I think what he was maybe anticipating was being able to take my knight. But again, the problem is I can take on F8. If he takes on G2, I take on E7. He's just down. He's down a full rook here. And if he takes back on G7 like in the game, I just take this pawn and I'm just up a pawn for free. Like I said earlier, this kind of situation would work out for him if maybe the rook was on like E8 or F7 instead. So let's say I did some. Let's say he did, rook E8 or something. And let's imagine I don't take the pawn, just for instance. Now the move E4, now I can't really take on G7 as easily, because after bishop takes G7, pawn takes F3, he's attacking two of my pieces. And I'm going to pretty much end up losing some kind of material here. If I take on F3, king takes back or knight takes back. and now I'm just down a piece, which is pretty bad. So this kind of sequence specifically works for me because the rook is still at f8. I need to be able to take the bishop, then hit the rook at the same time. So we do take the bishop. He takes back. We win the pawn. f4. I go rook d3. I could have traded queens, which would have been fine as well, but rook d3, creating some threats looks pretty good. Knight c5 for this knight d7 idea, which we do play here. We get the rook on the 7th rank. Black goes rook d8. I probably, again, could trade rooks and be fine here. I did queen d4 check, and then I took on d8, and then I played e5, threatening the knight. If the knight moves away, I can play now rook d1 for the pin. Playing e6 isn't as good because the knight can go back. I'm not winning the knight just yet. Maybe his best move would be like knight, almost going back to like g8 here, which is pretty passive. I would still play rook d1, probably take. This is still a much better position for me. My pieces are just way more active at this point. In the game, though, he took my queen. Very important that we don't make an easy-to-make blunder here. A lot of people might say, oh, I could take on f6 with check and then take the queen back. But if we take on f6, the queen can aim back towards f6, and we're losing a piece. We're losing a queen, which is terrible. So we should definitely take the queen back right away, and there's no good way for black to protect both threats. He moved the knight, but then I made the fork. He ended up resigning because he's just going to lose material. So I think this game example really highlights how to play against an opponent who has the space advantage. It's really important that you play pawn breaks to attack the center. You want to try and chip away at it. Black did have the pawns on, e5 and d4, but I didn't just let him have these. I didn't just, let him have the extra space. I proactively worked toward this plan of playing e3 at the right time. Eventually, once I got e3 in, then the position opens up a little bit. I have this target on e5. Black can't protect it well, and we're going to end up winning material. He probably still should have played f4, like I said, during the game. I moved the rook away. But he's still going to lose this pawn. There's no way to stop, like, bishop takes e5. Even if he pins here, I can still just take the pawn. So black was going to lose material there, but he could have played more solid himself. He could have played instead of taking the pawn, maybe going back for backing up a little bit. Maybe he could have played like b6 and then c5. The reason c5 doesn't work right here is because I would just take with the knight. But he has some ways he could have protected his sitter a bit better, but I was able to do a good job of attacking it. So a good example of a game where the opponent has extra space or a space advantage, and how do we play against a player who's got that. So anyways, though, hopefully you enjoyed the game. That's it for this video. Hope you guys have a good rest of the day, and I will see you around in the next video then. All right, bye everybody.